Okay, so in 1918, a huge law was passed in Britain that gave some women the right to vote for the very first time. Now, you've probably heard the story that it was a simple thank you, a reward for all their hard work during World War I. But you know what? The real story is so much more interesting. It's a complicated mix of fear, shrewd politics, and a revolution that was already brewing. Let's get into it.
Right. This is the big question, isn't it? Did World War I give women the vote? And for a long time, the answer you'd get was pretty much a straight yes. But history is almost never that simple. The war was absolutely a catalyst, no doubt about it, but it was far from the whole story.
And this is that simple story we're all so familiar with. You can probably picture it now, right? Those iconic images of women in the munitions factories, women driving ambulances, basically keeping the entire country running while the men were off at war. The whole narrative is that a grateful government just had to reward this incredible service with a vote. It's a really powerful story, but it's just not the complete picture.
Okay, so to get the real story of why this law passed in 1918, we've actually got to jump back in time a bit. We need to see what British society was really like before the war even started.
You see, the war didn't just suddenly create the working woman out of nowhere. By 1914, millions of women were already working, and not just in the old traditional jobs like domestic service. They were taking on new roles as typists, telephonists, shop workers. A small but growing number were even going to university and breaking into professions like teaching and medicine. The wheels of social change were already spinning long before 1914.
And it wasn't just women's roles that were changing. Get this, the entire voting system was frankly a mess. Under the old rules, to vote, a man basically had to live at a single stable address. So what happened when millions of soldiers went overseas to fight? Yep, they lost their right to vote. Can you believe that? The government knew this was totally unacceptable and that the system desperately needed fixing, whether women got the vote or not.
So the war didn't create these problems, but it absolutely cranked up the heat. It basically turned the whole political situation into a giant pressure cooker, and politicians were scrambling to find a release valve before the whole thing blew. And this brings us to the official reason, the one that fits that simple story we talked about. This is Prime Minister Asquith speaking in 1916. Now, you have to remember, this is a guy who was firmly against women's suffrage before the war. But even he had to stand up and admit that women's contribution was so vital, their case for the vote had become, in his own words, unanswerable. But, and this is a huge but, there was another, let's say, more practical reason for this change of heart. As the famous suffragette Sylvia Pankhurst pointed out later, a massive factor was just plain old fear. Politicians vividly remembered the pre-war protests, the window smashing, the chaining themselves to railings, and they were terrified that if they ignored women again, that militancy would come roaring back. So when you put it all together, you see it wasn't just one thing. It was this complex cocktail of motivations. You had gratitude for the war work, for sure, but you also had a healthy dose of political fear about more protests. You had the practical problem of needing to give soldiers the vote. And you had this general worry about social unrest, especially with revolutions kicking off in places like Russia. So with all of those different things, pushing and pulling, what did the actual law end up looking like? Well, when you dig into the details, you can see it for what it was, a really carefully constructed political compromise. The immediate effect was absolutely staggering. I mean, this one law, almost overnight, tripled the size of the British electorate. It jumped from around 7 million people to over 21 million. That is a seismic shift in any democracy. But the big question is, who were all these new voters? And this is where you really see the compromise in action. For men, things got a lot simpler. If you were over 21, you could vote. If you were a soldier, you could vote at 19. But for women, well, there were some major strings attached. You had to be over 30, and you had to meet certain property qualifications or have gone to university. It was nowhere near equal. And here is the single biggest irony of this whole story. Remember those young, working-class women in the propaganda posters? The munitionettes in the factories? The vast majority of them were under 30 and didn't own property. And that means that the very women's war work was held up as the reason for getting the vote were still left out. They still couldn't vote. And that's why it's such a mistake to look at the 1918 Act and think, job done. It wasn't the finish line, not even close. It was a massive, critical first step, but it was absolutely an unfinished revolution. the fight was far from over. A year later, in 1919, Nancy Astor became the first woman to actually take her seat in Parliament, which was a huge milestone. But it still took another 10 years, a full decade, before the Equal Franchise Act of 1928 finally gave women the vote on the exact same terms as men. The 1918 Act cracked the door open, but it took another 10 years of pushing to get it all the way open.
Still, the act did have an immediate and kind of wild result. The very first election held under these new rules took place just a month after the war ended, and it produced a twist that I bet nobody saw coming.
So, get this. The very first woman ever elected to the British Parliament was an Irish nationalist named Constance Markievicz. And if that's not interesting enough, at the time of her election victory, she was literally sitting in Holloway Prison for her political activism. And to top it all off, as a member of Sinn Féin, she followed their policy of abstentionism, meaning she refused to take her seat at Westminster. So the first woman elected never even set foot in the House of Commons. What a start, huh?
Which brings us right back around to our big question. Was the 1918 Act a grateful reward for women's sacrifice, or was it a calculated compromise born out of political pressure, fear, and decades of struggle? Well, as it so often does, the real story is somewhere in the messy, complicated, and fascinating space right in between.